I've been doing a lot of thinking lately, and this idea has formed in my head that no matter what type of book you are writing, whether it's just general fiction, contemporary fiction, sci-fi, fantasy, mystery, women's fiction, horror, thriller, there are several pillars of writing that make up any successful story. No matter what the story is or its genre, you absolutely must have these things in place in order to make a successful novel. And the better grasp you have on each of these pillars, the better your book will be. My name is Kristen Hamilton. I am a fiction book editor. I have edited over 400 books now. Several of the books that I have edited have gone on to win awards and become Amazon bestsellers. And I work in everything under the fiction umbrella. Sci-fi, fantasy, horror, thriller. I've done mysteries, I've done women's fiction, I've done contemporary fiction. A lot of variety comes across my desk and it's fun. It's fun. I mean, I get paid to read and edit books. I mean, come on. And I've been doing this since 2012, so 8 years now. 8 years actually at the end of September. Yeah, it's something that I love doing. Okay, so these pillars are conflict, plot and story structure, pacing, tension, and character development. So each of these things are major proponents of what I'm looking for in my manuscript critique process. Manuscript critiques are really, really fun. Okay, real talk. Basically, what I'm doing in a manuscript critique is I am reading the author's book. I just literally sit back and read, and it's amazing. It's as awesome as you would think it would be. Along the way, though, I am adding comments, things that might not necessarily be working. For example, if chapter 5 is a little bit slow, I will highlight that and make a note. Hey, it's a little slow in here. Can you condense? Can you trim down this part right here? On the other hand, there might be some parts of the book that are not developed enough. Like, whoa, that scene went by way too fast. Slow it down. Here's what I would recommend how to do that. The manuscript critique process is a really cool thing because it allows me as the editor to give you, the author, feedback on what is working and what is not working in your manuscript. And these pillars of writing are what I am basically looking for in the manuscript critique process. I am going to be going over each of the pillars of writing, and at the very end of each section, I'm going to include 2, sometimes 3 questions to ask. So this is something that you as an author can ask yourself as far as, am I doing this correctly? Do I have a good grasp on this in my manuscript? So I think we're good. I think we're good to move forward. Okay, now that I've laid out the ground rules and the overall presentation, let's get started. Yeah. Okay, conflict. Conflict is probably one of the most important parts. Obviously, each of the pillars of writing are very important, but the conflict is really what is the conflict is the engine that drives your book, essentially. Without a central source of conflict, or better, several sources of conflict, many aspects of the book will suffer. If you don't have conflict, you're not going to have very good pacing. You're not going to have very good tension. You're not going to have a whole lot of overall reader engagement. So basically what this means is that if you don't have a clear source of conflict in your book, everything else falls apart. Basically, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, but yeah, a central source of conflict is so important. So the central source of conflict, it must be immediately noticeable. Without a central source of conflict, it just makes it more difficult for a reader to get involved in your story, to stay engaged with your story, and to really continue reading your book. It's critical that you have a main source of conflict become clear in your book early on in the book, and have the protagonist face a series of obstacles, each one worse than the last, on the way to solving this conflict. If you don't adequately convey or execute the book's main source of conflict, it makes the book not as engaging or as exciting as it should be. Now, obviously, most books have an external source of conflict. Let's use the Harry Potter series for an example. Everyone knows Harry Potter. Everyone has read Harry Potter. So in the Harry Potter series, Voldemort is the external source of conflict. If Harry does not defeat Voldemort, the world as they know it will be overrun with evil, right? That's a very basic, very obvious source of external conflict. Now, there are also internal sources of conflict, okay? Now, internal sources of conflict are so much fun. I'm sorry, I'm really excited about this. Internal sources of conflict would be, for example, let's say, okay, so in the Harry Potter series, there's a part of the series where Harry goes through this internal conflict where he wonders if maybe he's not as good as he thinks he is. Maybe he is the bad guy after all. Maybe he does have that evil deep inside him. So the internal source of conflict is really good because in addition to the whatever's going on externally in the character, in the protagonist's life, there is also this internal source of conflict where they're battling with themselves or they're not sure they're making the right decision. These are really good sources of internal conflict that will help readers stay engaged with your story. They'll help readers connect with your book's main character more, and overall, they'll make a more engaging book. And me personally, I believe that the best books are ones that incorporate both an external source of conflict and an internal source of conflict. So, questions to ask yourself and your book, okay? Does your story begin with some sort of conflict, either internal or external, or both? Does the beginning of the book set up the bigger conflict of the entire novel that drives the protagonist toward his or her end goal? Okay, moving on. Plot and story structure. In fiction books, the plot goal / overall premise of the book is laid out at the start of the book alongside the conflict, okay? Basically, the story's plot reflects how to solve the problem of the central source of conflict, okay? So in the Harry Potter series, Harry must defeat Voldemort, and this is laid out in book 1 of the series. Harry learns that he is the chosen one, the one that they have prophesized about, and he knows from the very beginning that he is going to be the one responsible for bringing down the most evil villain of all of the wizarding world, right? If you are writing a book series, it is absolutely critical to get the overall plot goal laid out as well as the series goal. Okay, so when you have multiple books in a series, let's say you have 3 books in a series, the first book is focused on laying out the overall plot goal for that one book, and then also the series goal for books 1, 2, and 3. Subplots are not the main book's plot, but they keep things moving. To add sophistication, intrigue, and more layers to your book, consider adding in subplots. Subplots are where you add little plot arcs through your book. On top of this, you can add character arcs throughout your book. And actually, that's a really important thing that I'm going to be talking about in the characters, for the characters pillar. Basically, character arcs can serve as plot arcs in which the character undergoes a transformation by the end of the book. They come to a realization, they understand that how they acted at the beginning of the book was wrong, or they realize that they're more powerful, more strong stronger than they originally thought at the beginning of the book. There are so many ways that characters can change, and a character arc is a really good way to add in a subplot to your book. One of the main things that will drive your story's plot into the ground is by having unnecessary scenes. Each and every scene needs to show some type of forward progression through the novel, whether that is character development or the plot moving forward. It's very important that you make sure that every single scene in your book belongs. So your book's plot should start to become clear no later than about 25% into your book. So each book is comprised of a beginning, middle, and the end. At the beginning is basically setting up, kind of a regular day in the life of your protagonist. Then there is an inciting event, something that happens in the character's life that changes everything. And usually this is where it starts to become obvious that there's a problem that the main character needs to resolve. And this is where your plot goal starts to take shape. The book's protagonist will acknowledge the issue, the main source of conflict. Remember, that's the thing that's driving your book. So there's a source of conflict. The book's main character needs to realize, hey, I need to do something to fix this issue. And that is when your character enters the middle of the book, which is really the meat of the book, and things start going now. So in the book's middle, there are going to be several incidents where your character needs to overcome certain obstacles in order to reach his or her plot goal. And usually, if you look at it, there is it kind of looks like a roller coaster. There's a obstacle 1, goes up, obstacle 1, and then obstacle 2, and then the book's climax. And obviously, as each of these obstacles are taking place, the book's tension will keep building. Readers will continue to stay engaged because there's so much on the line. And a good way to show this is through raising the stakes and really making the stakes obvious. This is another thing that we will talk about as another one of the pillars of writing. So your climax of the novel should take place around the 75%, 80% of the way through your manuscript. The climax of the book is where all the excitement reaches its peak. After the climax is the resolution. And this is basically how the book ends, where the characters are at, what lessons they've learned after the climax and all the events of the book takes place. And this is basically where you leave off your readers. It's important that your resolution is something that is satisfying to readers. You want to make sure that you end your book with a bang. The beginning and the end chapters are really the most important ones. Those are the ones that readers are going to remember the most. So it's really important that you nail it. Okay, so questions to ask for the plot and story structure. Number 1, is the plot goal for the book laid out from the start, and does it resolve at the end of the book satisfactorily? satisfactorily. So this is important. You absolutely have to make sure that your book is a satisfactory read. You want readers to walk away with a sense of fulfillment. You want readers to be able to finish the last page of your book and really realize what you're trying to say in your book. And this one is important. Are there scenes in the book that do not serve the plot and don't seem to have a point? In quite a few of the books that I edit and critique, there are scenes that are just seem to be thrown in there without really a purpose or a point. So when you're going through your book, when you're writing your book, or when you're self-editing your book after the fact, you want to make sure that you have a critical eye, that every single scene contributes to the forward momentum of the book. Now, that means that every single scene needs to contribute to character development or plot progression in one way or another. And this is a really good time to segue into pacing. Okay, look. We're all busy. There is a lot of material out there to read. So if a book isn't grabbing my attention, if I'm kind of feeling like reading the book is a chore more than anything, then that is usually a sign that the book doesn't have good pacing. In the current market, readers prefer plot-driven fiction. They prefer to read a story about a character overcoming a major obstacle by the end of the book. Each scene must contribute to the character overcoming the obstacle before them, heightening suspense and tension as the climax approaches. So there are a couple issues that can arise with pacing. One is too slow pacing and one is too fast pacing. In too slow pacing, this issue usually comes up when there is underdeveloped sources of conflict, no clear plot, unlikable characters or underdeveloped characters. So this is where you could start to see the pillars of writing starting to come together, because the conflict, character development, tension, these are some major pillars that we're talking about here. And these pillars are also supporting the pacing in your book. So if you don't have a good grasp on character development, tension, plot progression, conflict, if you don't have a good grasp on those things, your book's pacing is going to suffer. Now, there are some books in which the plot development, the character development, the tension, everything is good, but the book's pacing is still slow because of showing versus telling issues. Showing versus telling essentially means that instead of allowing the action to unfold on the page, the author is glossing over that action or summarizing it by telling. Okay, and I am actually going to read an example from the blog on showing versus telling on my website. Okay, so a really basic example of this is you have one sentence that says, he's tall. You have another sentence that says, when he stood, his head brushed against the ceiling. Okay, so by that sentence, his head is brushing against the ceiling, you can tell, obviously he's a tall dude, right? Now, that is a good example of showing something, putting this character in an environment that allows the reader to kind of piece two and two together to understand, hey, this guy's tall, as opposed to the other sentence that's purely telling, he's tall. Some ways to show instead of tell in your writing. You want to incorporate action and dialogue. So in the example, when he stood, his head brushed against the ceiling, that is using action. It's basically he's standing up, action, and his head is brushing against the ceiling, action, okay? So that's a really simple way to integrate showing into your story. Another way is to be descriptive and specific, especially when it makes a difference to the story. This is really important. You want to keep your descriptions for important things like fight scenes or pivotal moments in the book, or especially the climax. You want to keep those scenes, you want to describe them very specifically. And you can do this by using sensory detail. Using those five senses is a really good way to draw readers into your story and make your scene come alive on the page. A caveat, okay? Do not show everything in the novel. It's not necessary to show every single little thing. So if your character is getting dressed in the morning and it's just a regular day, just a regular small detail, okay, that is not necessary to say, oh, she looked to her right and felt the cashmere in her closet. No. You want to reserve showing for scenes of importance. Things like a turning point, conflict, a setback or an obstacle, a crisis that your character has to deal with. Anything like this, it's fantastic. Show. Everything else, all the minor details, things that are not important, that's okay to tell. Okay, the other issue with pacing is too fast pacing. And this tends to happen when there is a fast-paced scene. Think a shootout between your main character and the bad guy. And the author just writes it too fast. So you're basically doing a disservice to your novel, because in high-stakes situations like this, it's really important to slow down time. So basically, what happens to humans in a period of really high stress is that things seem to slow down. Time seems to slow down. And this happens when the adrenaline response kicks in, right? So if you have a similar situation in your story where it's the book's climax, or it's one of the major obstacles, or one of the crises that the character is dealing with in the book, it's really important that you make sure that you are slowing down and exploiting the situation and really leaving your readers grasping onto every word to really draw things out. So depending on whatever situation is taking place in your book, if your character is going through an adrenaline response, for example, he or she might experience diminished sound. They might have their heartbeat pounding in their ears. They could be super focused on the threat, so almost like a tunnel vision. So one of my notes here on this from my manuscript critique service is you want to slow down the scene and milk it for all it's worth. And that's totally true. This is one of the marks of good pacing, is you want to make sure that you aren't explaining the scene too quickly, but you also want to make sure that you're not going too slow as well. So it can be a difficult balance, but getting that balance is really what pacing is all about. Okay, so questions to ask for pacing. Does the book drag in spots due to excessive narration or from uninteresting scenes? So another thing that is important is that your writing itself can really have an impact on your book's pacing. Unclear writing, vague narration, anything where the writing is not crisp and clear and easy to understand right away is what you want to avoid. You absolutely need to make sure that that everything that you are writing is understandable. Here's an example. Some authors, especially new authors, they feel like they need to be overly formal in their writing. And this is usually a sign of someone who just doesn't have experience, and there's nothing wrong with that. But they tend to adopt a stilted and a formal writing style, in the sense that they use too formal vocabulary words, or you might have heard the phrase like a $5 word or a $20 word or whatever, and those high vocabulary words are okay to use in moderation. But if you're an author and you're using these high level vocabulary words multiple times in one sentence, that's that's usually not where you want to be. So the issue with this is that when you're writing, when you have super high level vocabulary words, especially concentrated many times in one sentence or one paragraph, and even worse if your entire writing is like this, your entire book is like this, that could be really damaging, because instead of readers being able to easily understand what you're saying, it becomes more work to read your book than anything, in the sense of, instead of relaxing, I have my book, blah blah blah, it feels like you're reading a college textbook. And for fiction, that's not what we want. No. So your pacing can also take a hit if you have too many high-level vocabulary words and a stilted, formal writing style. It slows down the pacing of the book. It takes the reader out of the story. And really anything that takes the reader out of the story is detrimental, because your ultimate goal here is you want readers to get lost in your book. You want them to almost forget that they're reading. And so anything that takes readers out of that will slow your book's pacing. Okay, question number 2. Is the writing over wordy or vague, slowing down the pace of the scenes? So here's another example where writing itself can actually detract from your book's pacing and make the pacing slow. If the pacing is too slow, it just drastically reduces reader engagement. You just want to make sure that you keep the book's pacing going along at a good clip. Tension is the high-stakes feelings that readers will get when characters are in trouble. And when done properly, tension will propel a reader forward through the book, encouraging them to turn the page to find out what will happen next, whether it's in the story itself or to the character. Now, no matter what story you write, there are hundreds of situations. There are hundreds of ways that your book can play out. And as the author, it's your job to make sure that you are really making the characters, that you are making the readers aware of what could happen, all the things that could go wrong, all the things that are at stake. And the way that you do that is by having the characters aware of what's at stake. And basically, the higher the stakes, the more unputdownable your book will be. So how do you create tension in your book? There are a few ways. By further developing the sources of conflict, the internal and external sources of conflict, making sure that your overall plot is clear, the obstacles the characters must overcome. It's really important that you share what the characters will get from defeating these obstacles, whatever they are, as well as what is at stake if they fail in their goal. And finally, it also really, really helps if you have developed your characters themselves. That is a really important thing. If your character is unlikable, if your character is a jerk, if your character is just doesn't have any morals or doesn't have anything that they stand for, they don't have any specific personality quirks, They don't have anything that makes them stick out and be an individual, be unique. It makes for not as engaging of a book. And that is really what tension is all about. Tension is basically about making your readers care about your characters. You want your readers to become emotionally invested in your characters, and you want them to turn the page, right? To find out what happens to your characters. So this is another situation in which other things, such as the plot, the conflict, the characters, help support tension. And that's how, when I say that there are pillars of writing, these pillars are really, they're supporting each other, right? Imagine that you had a building, and this building is supported by several pillars or columns, okay? If you were to take out one of the pillars, what would happen? The entire thing would crumble. The pillars are all interdependent on each other. So you can't have a good source of tension if you haven't first developed your source of conflict, your plot, your characters. All these things work together to make for a very engaging novel. So a couple more ways that you can add tension in your book. Number one is that you want to leave scenes hanging in order to create tension. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that it's basically leaving a chapter on a cliffhanger. The character is driving down the road and then all of a sudden, bam, blindsided. What happened? Obviously it was a car accident. Are they okay? What's going to happen? Are they injured? Are they dead? And these are the things that are going through readers' minds. So they have to turn the page. Another way to add tension is by starting that next chapter where they had to turn the page. Next chapter starts with a different character. Okay, so here's the thing about using different perspectives in your book. There are rules about this, okay? If you choose to tell parts of the story in a different character's perspective, you need to do so in a different chapter or a different section. Each section or each chapter is told by one character and one character only. If you want to switch to a different character's perspective, that can happen in the next scene. And this narrative style in and of itself can create a lot of tension just by design. What I mean by this is one character doesn't always know what the other character is thinking. So let's say, for example, it's a romance, okay? You have a girl and you have the boy, or two girls or two boys or whatever, and you have these two characters that feel a certain way about each other. But this character doesn't know, she has a crush on this character, but she doesn't know that this character also has a crush on her. And she doesn't think that he likes her, so she's timid and shy and she's too afraid to talk to him. This type of narration style can be very simple yet very effective, just by playing off of what the readers might know, but the characters don't. Back to the end of that chapter where the character got in a car accident and the readers are turning the page. They start the next chapter following the other character who is in his or her own situation. Let's say this character is the doctor at the hospital. The doctor at the hospital might be doing rounds on her patients, and all of a sudden there's a code blue, and an ambulance comes rushing in, and she sees that her friend was in a car accident. And that is how you could play these two stories off each other and merge it by, even though you're having two different character perspectives, you are using their individual stories to play off each other, not only to create your story, but also to create tension. Questions to ask. Okay, first and foremost, what are the stakes? You need to make sure that the stakes are very clear. Your readers need to understand what would happen if this mission would fail. What happens if Harry Potter doesn't defeat Voldemort? What would happen if Voldemort killed Harry? Not only would it be the end of Harry's life, but darkness and evil would take over the wizarding world. Is tension created at the outset of the book? Is the protagonist compelling enough to heighten tension by the reader caring about him or her? Now, this is another important thing. The character development is very, very important. You want to make sure that you're creating likable characters that readers will relate to. Are scenes left hanging to create tension? That is where those cliffhangers come into effect. You can also use foreshadowing. That's a really effective tool. And that leads into this final question. Are elements or details added to propel the story forward in a way to invoke tension? Character development. Characters and their level of development is one of the key parts that will make or break a book. Integrating human emotion is a critical step to getting readers to connect to your story. So, to be well developed, each character must have a past, a need, a fear, a dream, through action, narration, and dialogue. So think characters have conversations with each other. They can tell, little snippets of each other about them. They could tell little snippets about themselves to each other. Characters can have flashbacks. They can remember things. They can encounter a situation and be reminded of something similar that they went through 5 years ago. So one important thing is that when you're doing your character development, you want to make sure that you're not spending too much time going on and on about a character's history or backstory, because that can get boring really fast. Instead, you should incorporate character development wherever you can in order to truly allow readers to glimpse into who they are as a person, their history, and how that has made them into the person they are today. And obviously, your protagonist needs to have the most character development of all to make him or her much more likable and relatable to your characters. Secondary characters should enhance the protagonist's story. So secondary characters, they do need to be developed, not necessarily as richly developed as the protagonist is, but secondary characters should also have their own quirks or ways of speaking or memories or backgrounds. One really fun thing that I always recommend authors do is have a character change. This is it's very rewarding to see a character become a different person by the end of the book. In a zombie book I critiqued a long time ago, the book's main character had become a zombie, and by the end of the book there was like an experimental doctor, an experimental scientist or something, and she was cured. She became human again. She's still having human thoughts throughout the book. So I recommended to the author that the protagonist have guilt for killing all those people when she was a zombie. But by the end of the book, she can realize that it was literally outside of her control because she wasn't in control. If you choose to have your protagonist go through a character transformation, a character arc, your character should have small realizations throughout the way through the book in order to make their character change at the end of the book make sense. Even bad guys need to have character development, okay? So not everyone is wholly bad or wholly good, okay? Everyone is a multifaceted, complex person, and your book's characters need to reflect that. So even the bad guys are not, they should not be 100% evil. It actually works really well if you're able to make readers a little bit sympathetic to the bad guys. It kind of makes readers feel torn as to whether they want the bad guy to, you know, just die and disappear, or, you know, maybe they can understand the bad guy. They can understand what made them evil in the first place, and you know, kind of root for the bad guy in a way. And above all, integrating human emotion is a critical step in getting readers to connect with your story. The best and most memorable characters are those that have complex lives. They feel things, they care about things, they get angry about things, they have real emotions. Questions to ask: is the protagonist sympathetic from the start? Definitely want to make sure that your protagonist is likable. Are the characters rich and developed, or are they flat and stereotypic? So you want to make sure that your characters are like real people. So a lot of authors choose to base characters off of people that they know in real life. That's a really easy way to make sure that you are integrating all of the character flaws, idiosyncrasies, and everything that makes a person human. Some authors choose to create characters based off themselves. Everything, you know, that is all fine. Just make sure that your characters are developed, that they each have a want, a need, a fear, you know, all those things. Are there characters of different races? It's very important that we have characters of all races, all backgrounds, all levels of education. You know, you don't want to have one cookie cutter character. One thing you also want to make sure is that you are not stereotyping your characters. So, for example, if you have Black characters that are portrayed as bums or criminals or any other negative role, any other negative stereotypical role, that's definitely something that you want to take a hard look at, because that is just perpetuating a stereotype, and that is not something that we want to keep doing. Do the secondary characters enhance and enrich the protagonist's story? Does the protagonist have a clear character arc that shows growth, change, decision, or resolution by the end of the book? So these pillars of novel writing, conflict, plot and story structure, pacing, tension, and character development, they all work together to create a super great, hard to put down book. And the better balance that you have on these pillars, and the more you have mastered these pillars, the better book that you will have. Each of the pillars of writing relies on the other pillars, just like a building that is supported by pillars or columns. What would happen if you removed one of those columns? The building would crumble. And the same thing is true about your book. If you don't have these pillars well developed and well balanced with each other, your book is not going to be as successful as it should be. And as you grow as an author, you will start to see how each of these pillars are interdependent on each other. So it's really important that you have your book's conflict in order, that you have the central source of conflict obviously developed, obvious in the story, in order to create your plot and story structure after it. If you don't have a central source of conflict, your book's plot is not really going to be obvious. If you don't have good tension, your book's pacing is going to slow. And if you don't have good character development, it's less likely that your readers are going to connect well with your characters, and therefore, no matter how good of a story you have written, if the characters are not really likable or relatable, then readers aren't going to care. So that's it. I hope you guys learned some things about the pillars of writing and what makes for a good book. Obviously, practice makes perfect. So the more that you work at these things, the better you'll get. It's also very, very good, a good idea to enlist a professional editor. Editors are trained to notice these things. We read books for a living. Best of luck with writing your book and finding the perfect balance of these 5 pillars of writing. I will be around answering questions after this Write Hive event. But if you have any specific questions or if you want to get in touch, my website is kristencorrects.com. My email is kristen@kristencorrects.com. Thanks for watching. Bye.